At the family dinner, my sister-in-law joked, "Too bad your baby looks nothing like your husband." My husband laughed, "Maybe she has a secret." Everyone joined in. I just smiled, stood up and handed him an envelope. "Since we're sharing secrets, open this." The laughter stopped. His face turned white. "Too bad your baby looks nothing like your husband." Daisy's words sliced through the warm evening air like a blade through silk. The dining room, moments before filled with the comfortable chatter of family dinner, suddenly felt arctic. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused midair. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hold its breath. I had spent 7 days preparing for this dinner. 7 days of scrubbing, cooking, arranging, and rearranging everything to perfection. The pot roast had been slow cooking for 8 hours, seasoned with herbs from my own garden. Our best china, the Waterford set we'd received as a wedding gift, gleamed under the chandelier. I'd even driven to 3 different flower shops to find the perfect autumn arrangement for the centerpiece. Why? Because after 3 years of marriage, I was still desperately trying to prove myself worthy of being Jared's wife to his family. Still trying to show them I wasn't just some girl their golden boy had settled for, but someone who could elevate their family name. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting there with Daisy's cruel words echoing in my ears. She sat across from me, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her wine glass, that smirk playing on her lips like she'd just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. Daisy had always been jealous of me, I knew that. Jared's younger sister had been the family princess until I came along, and she'd never quite forgiven me for stealing even a fraction of the spotlight. But this was different. This wasn't just sisterly competition. This was calculated cruelty designed to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered. I turned to Jared, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting, no, needing, him to defend me, to defend us, to stand up and tell his sister that her comment was completely inappropriate and hurtful, that George was beautiful and perfect and absolutely, undeniably his son. Instead, my husband, the man who had promised to honor and protect me, let out that nervous laugh, that awful, weak chuckle he always made when he wanted to fit in with his family instead of standing up for what was right. "Maybe Olivia has a secret," he said, and I felt something inside me shatter like crystal hitting concrete. The betrayal was instant and complete, not because of what he said but because of what he didn't say. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend our son. He threw me to the wolves to earn a few cheap laughs from people who would never truly accept me anyway. The laughter that followed was like acid in my veins. His mother, Patricia, who had insisted I call her mom but always said it with a slight hesitation, actually giggled behind her napkin. His father, usually so stern and proper, was chuckling into his whiskey. Even his cousin Rebecca, who I'd thought liked me, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes sparkling with the kind of malicious delight that comes from witnessing someone else's downfall. But it was Maria's reaction that hurt almost as much as Jared's betrayal. Our housekeeper, who had been with us since George was born, who had seen me cry from exhaustion during those first sleepless months, who knew how much I loved my son. Even she froze in the doorway with the dessert plates, her kind eyes wide with shock and something that looked dangerously close to pity. I could hear George's soft breathing through the baby monitor on the side table. My beautiful, innocent 10-month-old son was sleeping peacefully upstairs while the adults he should be able to trust were destroying his mother's reputation downstairs. He had no idea that his legitimacy was being questioned, that his very existence was being treated like a punchline. The worst part, the part that made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, was that this wasn't the first time Jared had questioned George's parentage. From the moment our son had been placed in my arms at the hospital, Jared had been planting seeds of doubt like a farmer preparing a toxic harvest. "His nose looks too sharp for our family," he'd whispered one evening when he thought I was asleep, studying our newborn son's face like he was searching for evidence of my infidelity. "Are you sure about the timing?" he'd asked me just last month, pretending it was casual conversation while we watched George play with his blocks. But I'd caught the calculation in his eyes, the way he was mentally counting backwards from George's birth date. I'd seen him staring at our son during bath time, during feeding time, during those precious quiet moments when George would babble and reach for his father's face. Instead of love and wonder in Jared's expression, I'd seen confusion, suspicion, and something that looked disturbingly like disappointment. Each incident had been small enough to dismiss, private enough to pretend it hadn't happened. I told myself he was just adjusting to fatherhood, that new dads sometimes felt disconnected from their babies. I'd made excuses for him the way wives do when they're not ready to face the truth about their marriages. But this dinner, this public humiliation in front of people whose approval I'd been desperately seeking for years, was the line I couldn't pretend he hadn't crossed. I looked around the table, taking in each face. Patricia was still smiling, that cold, satisfied smile she got when she felt superior to someone. Robert was reaching for the wine bottle, completely comfortable with what had just transpired. Rebecca was whispering something to her husband, probably already planning how she'd share this gossip with the rest of the extended family. And Jared, my husband, my partner, the father of my child, was avoiding my eyes entirely, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his dinner plate. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. They were all waiting for my reaction, probably expecting tears or protestations or maybe even a dramatic exit. They wanted a scene. They wanted me to break down so they could comfort each other about poor Jared being married to such an unstable woman. Instead, something crystallized inside me, a clarity I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I wasn't going to beg for their approval or defend myself against accusations that any decent person would know were baseless. I was going to do something better. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Every eye in the room followed me as I smoothed my dress and walked toward the bedroom with the kind of calm that comes from finally knowing exactly what needs to be done. Behind me, I could hear confused murmurs starting up again, probably wondering if I was going to pack a bag or call my mother or lock myself in the bathroom to cry. They had no idea that I was walking toward something that would change all of our lives forever. In my jewelry box, underneath the pearls Jared had given me for our anniversary, lay a plain white envelope. I'd been carrying this secret for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Tonight, surrounded by people who thought they knew better than I did about my own life and my own child, was exactly the right moment. When I returned to that dining room, envelope in hand, I would show them all exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has finally had enough. My fingers traced the edge of the envelope as I pulled it from beneath my pearl necklace. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 3 months of secrets and the power to obliterate everything Jared and his family thought they knew about me. It had been a Tuesday morning in July when I'd finally reached my breaking point. George had been napping and I'd found Jared in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone with that distant expression he'd been wearing more and more lately. When I'd suggested we take a family photo for George's baby book, he'd actually flinched. Maybe when he's older, he'd mumbled, not even looking up from his screen. When his features are more defined. As if our son was some incomplete sketch rather than a perfect, beautiful child who deserved his father's unconditional love. That afternoon, after Jared left for work, I'd sat on our bedroom floor with my laptop, researching DNA testing facilities. Not the at-home kits that everyone advertised on television. Those felt too casual, too unreliable for something this important. I needed clinical accuracy, professional documentation, irrefutable proof. The drive to Riverside Genetics took exactly 43 minutes. I'd chosen them specifically because they were far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. The building was sterile and anonymous, tucked between a dental office and a tax preparation service in a strip mall that could have been anywhere in America. Dr. Martinez had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but her expression grew serious when I explained what I needed. She was probably in her 50s, with graying temples and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every family secret imaginable. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked, her voice gentle but firm. "These tests can have consequences beyond just answers. Sometimes the truth creates more problems than the uncertainty." I'd considered her warning for exactly 3 seconds before nodding. "I need to know." The sample collection had felt surreal, like I was gathering evidence for a crime I hadn't committed. George's hair came from his little brush, golden strands so fine they almost floated away when I breathed too close. I'd wrapped them carefully in a clean tissue, my hands shaking slightly as I sealed them in the provided container. Jared's toothbrush had been easier to obtain but harder to stomach. Standing in our bathroom at 5 in the morning, carefully scraping bristles into a plastic bag, I'd felt like a stranger in my own home. This was what my marriage had become. Covert operations and secret investigations instead of trust and communication. The laboratory's waiting room had been nearly empty that morning, just me and an elderly man who kept checking his watch nervously. I'd filled out paperwork with steady hands, providing my contact information and selecting expedited processing. 2 weeks felt like an eternity, but standard processing took a month and I couldn't wait that long. Those 14 days had been the longest of my life. Every morning I'd wake up wondering if today would be the day the results arrive. Every evening I'd check our mailbox with my heart pounding, simultaneously hoping for and dreading the familiar logo of Riverside Genetics. Meanwhile, Jared's behavior had somehow gotten worse. He'd started working late more often, claiming new projects and demanding clients. When he was home, he'd interact with George like he was handling borrowed property. Careful, distant, temporary. During bath time, instead of the silly voices and playful splashing that used to fill our bathroom, there was only mechanical efficiency. The breaking point had come during a family barbecue at his brother's house. Jared's nephew Tommy had run up to show George a toy truck, and everyone had started commenting on how much the two boys looked alike. Normal family chatter, the kind of comparison that happens at every gathering. But I'd caught Jared's expression, a flash of something ugly and suspicious, like he was analyzing genetic evidence instead of watching children play. Later, when his sister-in-law had mentioned how much George resembled Jared at that age, he'd actually said, "Do you think so?" "I'm not sure I see it." I'd excused myself to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes, gripping the sink so hard my knuckles went white. The envelope had arrived on a Thursday, mixed in with utility bills and grocery store circulars like it was just another piece of routine mail. My hands had trembled as I'd torn it open, scanning past the technical jargon to find the conclusion that would determine the rest of my life. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The relief had been so overwhelming I'd actually sat down hard on our kitchen floor, the papers scattered around me like fallen leaves. All those months of whispered doubts, all those questioning looks, all those moments when I'd wondered if I was going insane, vindicated by cold, scientific fact. But the relief had quickly transformed into something else. Fury. White-hot, consuming rage at my husband for putting me through this hell, for making me doubt myself, for treating our son like a question mark instead of a blessing. I'd stared at those results for 3 hours, crying tears that shifted from relief to anger to something resembling grief. Because even though I now held proof of what I'd always known, something fundamental had broken between Jared and me. The fact that I'd needed this test at all meant our marriage was already damaged beyond simple repair. The smart thing would have been to confront him immediately, to march into his office, slam the papers on his desk, and demand an apology for months of psychological torture. But something deeper and more calculating had taken hold of me that day. I'd driven back to Riverside Genetics and requested multiple copies on official letterhead. Professional, undeniable documentation that no one could question or dismiss. I'd had them printed on heavy paper stock, the kind used for important legal documents, and requested sealed envelopes with the laboratory's official stamp. One copy went into our safe deposit box, another into a folder with our important financial documents, but the third, the one I'd chosen for maximum impact, went into a plain white envelope that I'd hidden in my jewelry box, underneath the pearls Jared had given me for our second anniversary. For weeks, I'd carried this secret like a weapon I wasn't ready to use. Every time Jared made another cutting comment about George's appearance, I'd touch that envelope through my jewelry box and feel a surge of power. Every time his family exchanged those knowing looks at dinner parties, I'd remind myself that I held the truth while they wallowed in their ugly assumptions. The hardest part had been watching Jared with George, seeing doubt where there should have been unconditional love. Our son would reach for his father's face with those chubby little hands, babbling happily, completely unaware that the man holding him was questioning his very legitimacy. But I'd waited, patient as a hunter, for exactly the right moment to reveal what I knew. Tonight, with Daisy's cruel words still echoing in our dining room and Jared's betrayal fresh and raw, that moment had finally arrived. Now, standing in our bedroom with that envelope in my hands, I could feel the weight of 3 months' worth of silence about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The walk back to the dining room felt like a procession to an execution, except I wasn't the one about to die. My footsteps were deliberately measured, each one echoing against the hardwood with a finality that seemed to announce that everything was about to change forever. They were still sitting exactly where I'd left them, frozen in an uncomfortable tableau of guilt and curiosity. Patricia had her wine glass halfway to her lips, suspended in mid-sip. Robert was cutting his roast with mechanical precision, clearly hoping to avoid eye contact. Rebecca whispered something urgent to her husband, who just shook his head and focused intently on his dinner plate. But Jared was fidgeting with his napkin, folding and refolding it into increasingly smaller squares. The nervous energy radiating from him was almost palpable, like he could sense something dangerous approaching but couldn't quite identify the threat. When I appeared in the doorway, envelope in hand, the entire room seemed to inhale collectively and hold its breath. "Since we're sharing secrets tonight," I said, my voice carrying across the room with crystalline clarity, "open this." I placed the envelope directly in front of him, my fingers lingering for just a moment on the white paper. The contact was electric, not romantic but charged with 3 months of accumulated power and the promise of revelation. Jared's cocky expression, the one that had been so casually cruel just minutes before, flickered like a candle in wind. He glanced up at me and for the first time in months, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't the wife he'd grown comfortable dismissing. This wasn't the woman who absorbed his family's mockery and his suspicious comments with martyred silence. This was someone new, someone who held cards he didn't even know were in play. "What's this about, Olivia?" His voice had lost its earlier confidence, taking on the cautious tone he used when he wasn't sure if he was in trouble. I didn't answer. I simply stood behind his chair, close enough that he could feel my presence, far enough that he had to crane his neck to see my face. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that everyone could feel it, though they couldn't yet understand why. Jared picked up the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. He turned it over, examining it like he was looking for clues about its content. There was nothing to see, just plain white paper with his name written in my careful handwriting. "Just open it," I said quietly, and something in my tone made even Patricia stop pretending to eat. He slid his finger under the flap casually, probably expecting a bill or maybe some appointment reminder that I'd been nagging him about. His movements were still lazy, still tinged with the arrogance that had allowed him to humiliate me just minutes earlier. But the moment, the exact instant, his eyes found the letterhead at the top of the page, everything changed. DNA Paternity Testing Laboratory was printed in bold, professional letters across the top of the document. Below it, in smaller but equally official font, were the words that would haunt him: conclusive paternity analysis results. I watched his face transform like I was seeing a time-lapse video of aging. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly I thought he might actually faint. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. He read the first paragraph, then started again from the beginning. His eyes moved frantically across the page, searching for some mistake, some loophole, some way for this document to say anything other than what it clearly stated. His fingers began to tremble. Actually tremble like he was suffering from some sudden illness. The paper rustled as his hands shook, and that small sound seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. 20 years of swagger, of easy confidence, of casual cruelty, all of it crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. This was the man who'd questioned his own son's legitimacy for months, who'd made me feel like a liar in my own home, who'd just thrown me under the bus for a few cheap laughs. Now he couldn't even form words. The silence stretched like taffy, becoming thicker and more suffocating with each passing second. I could hear George's soft breathing through the baby monitor, peaceful and innocent upstairs while his father's world collapsed downstairs. The grandfather clock's ticking suddenly seemed thunderous. Even Maria had stopped moving in the kitchen, probably sensing the tension from 3 rooms away. "What is it, Jared?" Daisy's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. She was leaning forward now, her earlier smugness replaced by vulture-like curiosity. She reached across the table with greedy fingers, trying to snatch the paper from her brother's paralyzed grip. I moved faster than I'd thought possible, stepping forward and placing my hand firmly over the document before she could touch it. My palm covered the results completely, but I could feel the weight of truth beneath my fingers. "Let your son explain what he's been accusing me of for months," I said, my voice carrying a deadly calm that made Patricia actually gasp. The words hung in the air like a curse. Everyone understood now that this wasn't just about whatever was on that paper. This was about months of hidden accusations, private suspicions, and the systematic destruction of trust in our marriage. Jared tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound that might have been the beginning of my name. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, then tried again. "Olivia, this isn't." He stopped, apparently realizing that every possible explanation would only make things worse. I waited, let him struggle. Let them all watch him try to find words that didn't exist for what he'd done. Rebecca cleared her throat nervously. "Maybe we should." "No." I didn't raise my voice, but the single word carried enough authority to silence her immediately. "We shouldn't do anything. Jared should explain to everyone why he felt the need to have his son's paternity tested in secret. Except he didn't do it in secret, did he? He just made accusations. He just planted doubts. He just made me feel like a criminal in my own home." Robert set down his fork with deliberate care, the sound of metal against china sharp and final. "Jared, what is she talking about?" But Jared couldn't answer. The man who had been so quick with cruel jokes and suspicious comments was now mute, staring at the proof of his own shameful behavior while his family watched him crumble. I removed my hand from the paper, letting them all see the official letterhead, letting the weight of professional documentation speak for itself. Then I walked to George's high chair, where my beautiful son was playing with his food, completely oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. I lifted him gently, kissing his forehead as he babbled happily and reached for my earrings with those perfect little fingers. He smelled like baby shampoo and innocence, like everything pure and good in a world that adults had made ugly with their suspicions and cruelty. When I turned back to face the table, George content in my arms, my silence was more devastating than any accusation I could have made. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need words. It just needs space to breathe. The silence shattered like glass when Jared finally found his voice, though what emerged was hardly recognizable as the confident man who'd been cracking jokes minutes earlier. "Olivia, honey, it was just." He stumbled over words like a drunk trying to navigate stairs, his face cycling through expressions of panic, shame, and desperate calculation. "You have to understand, it was just family banter. We were all just joking around." I bounced George gently in my arms, feeling his warm weight against my chest like armor. My son gurgled happily, reaching for the chandelier's light with chubby fingers, blissfully unaware that his legitimacy had just been proven beyond any shadow of doubt. "Jokes," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what we're calling months of questioning your son's paternity? Jokes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Patricia's wine glass trembled in her grip, and I watched Robert's jaw work silently as the full implications of what I'd just revealed began to sink in. Jared's hands were still shaking as he set the DNA results on the table, but he couldn't seem to stop looking at them, as if staring might somehow change what they said. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. People talk, they comment on how different he looks, and I just..." "What people?" I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to slice steel. "Your sister, your family, the same people who just spent the evening making me feel like an outsider in my own life." Daisy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since her failed grab for the papers, suddenly found her voice again. "We were just messing around, Olivia. God, you're being so dramatic about this whole thing." But her bravado was paper-thin now, and everyone could hear it. The woman who'd delivered that cruel opening line with such poisonous confidence now sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as everyone else. "Messing around," I said, and my laugh was completely devoid of humor. "You made a joke about my child's legitimacy in front of his father's entire family, and when my husband, who should have defended us, decided to pile on instead, you all laughed. That's your idea of messing around." George chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, clapping his hands together as if applauding the performance. The sound was so innocent, so purely joyful, that it made the adult's behavior seem even more grotesque by comparison. My calmness was clearly unnerving them more than any screaming fit would have. I could see it in their faces, the way they kept glancing at each other, waiting for me to break down, to give them the emotional explosion that would let them dismiss me as unstable or overreacting. Instead, I just stood there holding my son, letting the truth do all the heavy lifting. It was Robert who broke first. Jared's father, a man who'd built a successful construction business through sheer stubborn pride and who I'd never once heard admit he was wrong about anything, looked directly at me with something that might have been respect. "I owe you an apology, Olivia." His voice was gruff but sincere. "What happened here tonight was completely inappropriate. You deserved better from all of us, especially from my son." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Patricia's hand flew to her throat, and I saw tears actually forming in her eyes. Genuine tears, not the crocodile variety she'd deployed at various family gatherings when she wanted sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, reaching across the table toward me with trembling fingers. "I'm so sorry. We never should have. Jared never told us he was having these doubts, and we certainly never should have participated in that awful joke." Even Rebecca, who'd been whispering and giggling behind her hand just minutes earlier, looked mortified. She kept glancing between her dinner plate and my face, clearly wishing she could disappear entirely. "I think I should probably call an Uber," she mumbled to her husband, who nodded eagerly. But it was Daisy's reaction that surprised me most. The woman who'd started this whole mess, who'd delivered that opening blow with such calculated cruelty, was now staring at me with something that looked almost like fear. "You planned this," she said suddenly, her voice high and accusing. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you brought that envelope down here." I shifted George to my other hip and smiled, really smiled, for the first time all evening. "You're absolutely right. I did plan this. Just like you planned that little comment about George not looking like his father. The difference is my plan was based on truth." Daisy's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. She pushed back from the table so violently that her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This is ridiculous. I'm not sitting here and listening to this anymore." She grabbed her purse from the side table, but I caught the flash of embarrassment in her eyes before she could hide it behind righteous indignation. "No one's forcing you to stay," I said mildly. But before you go, maybe you should think about why you felt the need to make that comment in the first place. Was it really about George's appearance, or was it about something else entirely? She froze halfway to the door, and for a moment I thought she might actually engage with the question. But Daisy had never been one for self-reflection. "You're impossible," she spat and stormed out, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood until the front door slammed behind her. The silence that followed her exit was different from the earlier tension, heavier somehow, weighted with the reality of what had just transpired. Jared cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should talk privately about this, Olivia. Work through." No. The word came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. "Secrets deserve an audience, Jared. Just like your joke did." He flinched as if I'd slapped him, which in a way I supposed I had. "You wanted to air your doubts about our son's paternity in front of your family," I continued, my voice steady as stone. "You wanted to make me the punchline of your cruel little joke in front of people whose respect I've been trying to earn for 3 years. So now we handle the consequences the same way, publicly." The power dynamic in that room had shifted so completely that I could practically feel it in the air. These people who had been laughing at me, dismissing me, treating me like some kind of outsider or fraud, they were now watching me with something that looked remarkably like respect. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I genuinely liked what they saw when they looked at me. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze of forced normalcy. Robert and Patricia made awkward small talk about the weather while Rebecca and her husband escaped as soon as politely possible, mumbling excuses about early morning commitments. Maria cleared the barely touched dinner plates with the kind of careful silence that spoke volumes about what she'd witnessed. But it was later that night, after the last guest had left and George was finally asleep in his crib, that the real reckoning began. I stood in our bedroom staring at the suitcase I'd pulled from the closet. It wasn't a large bag, just the navy blue overnight case I'd bought for weekend trips before George was born. But something about seeing it open on our bed, waiting to be filled, felt monumental. Jared appeared in the doorway like a ghost, his face still pale from the evening's revelations. He watched me fold a sweater with methodical precision, each crease sharp and deliberate. "What are you doing?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile peace we'd managed to construct. "Packing." I didn't look up from the dresser drawer, my hands steady as I selected undergarments and nightclothes. "I need some space to think." "You're leaving." The panic in his voice was immediate and raw. "Olivia, please, we can work through this. Tonight was you publicly humiliating the mother of your child," I said, placing a pair of jeans in the suitcase with the same careful precision I'd used for everything else. "Tonight was you questioning your son's legitimacy in front of your entire family instead of defending him. Tonight was you choosing their cruel laughter over my dignity." He took a step into the room, his hands outstretched like he was approaching a wounded animal. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But leaving isn't going to solve anything." I finally turned to face him, really look at him, and was struck by how small he seemed. This man who had seemed so confident, so sure of himself just hours earlier, now looked like a child caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. "I'm not leaving permanently," I said, and watched the relief flood his features. "But I am showing you that I can. The woman you married, the one who would have cried herself to sleep and pretended this never happened, she's gone, Jared." The truth of those words settled between us like a physical presence. Something fundamental had shifted in that dining room, and we both knew there was no going back to who we'd been before. "Tell me what you need," he said, and there was a desperation in his voice I'd never heard before. "Tell me how to fix this." I closed the suitcase and sat on the edge of our bed, studying his face in the lamplight. "Marriage counseling. Real counseling, not just a few sessions so you can say we tried. Full financial transparency. I want access to every account, every investment, every decision. And a public apology to everyone who heard you question George's paternity." He nodded frantically, agreeing before I'd even finished speaking. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need. Olivia, I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to go this far." But his immediate capitulation, rather than reassuring me, only highlighted how desperate he was to return to the status quo. This wasn't about understanding what he'd done wrong. This was about damage control. "You agreed very quickly," I observed, lifting the suitcase from the bed. "Almost like you're not really thinking about what any of those things mean." "I am thinking," he protested, but his eyes were fixed on the bag in my hand. "I just want us to be okay again." "We're not going to be okay again, Jared. Not the way we were." I moved toward the door and he stepped aside to let me pass. "We might be something new, something different. But the marriage where I begged for your family's approval and swallowed your suspicions? That's over." Over the next 3 days I stayed at my sister's house, sleeping in her guest room while George napped in a portable crib we'd set up by the window. Jared called every few hours, sent flowers, left voicemails full of promises and explanations. But distance had given me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: clarity. When I returned home, I came back different, not just emotionally but practically. The first thing I did was change the password on our joint checking account, something I'd never done in 5 years of marriage. Then I called our financial advisor and requested copies of all our statements, investments, and insurance policies. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, clearly confused by my sudden interest in finances I'd previously left entirely to Jared. "Everything's fine," I assured him. "I'm just taking a more active role in our financial planning." It was amazing what I discovered once I started looking. Jared had been handling our money competently enough, but he'd also been making decisions, significant ones, without consulting me. A retirement account I hadn't known existed. Investment choices that prioritized his business over our family's security. Small things perhaps, but they painted a picture of a man who saw me as a passenger in my own life rather than a partner. I didn't confront him about these discoveries immediately. Instead, I quietly began transferring important documents to a safety deposit box in my name only. Birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, anything that might be crucial if our marriage didn't survive what we were going through. The most surprising discovery came when I was organizing our household files. Buried in a folder marked miscellaneous were 3 estimates for paternity testing services, all dated from 2 months after George was born. Jared had been researching DNA tests almost from the beginning, but had never followed through, until I did it for him. I sat in our home office staring at those crumpled estimates, and felt the last piece of my old self crack and fall away. The woman who had trusted blindly, who had assumed her husband's love meant he believed in her completely, was truly gone. In her place was someone harder, more calculating, but also more honest. If Jared could question something as fundamental as his son's paternity, then I needed to question everything else too. Our finances, our future, our compatibility. Nothing could be taken on faith anymore. That evening, when Jared found me reorganizing our important papers, he tried to make light of it. "Spring cleaning a little early this year?" I looked up at him, really looked, and saw not my protector or my partner but someone I needed to protect myself from. The realization was both devastating and liberating. "Something like that," I said, filing away the bank statements I'd been reviewing, just making sure I understand our situation completely. For the first time in our marriage, I was preparing for a future that might not include him. And surprisingly, that possibility didn't terrify me the way it once would have. It felt like freedom. 2 months later, George's first birthday party arrived like a test I hadn't studied for. The house was decorated with cheerful balloon arrangements and a banner that read, "Happy First Birthday, George," in bright primary colors, but underneath the festive atmosphere, tension simmered like water just before it boils. I'd spent weeks planning every detail, not out of perfectionist tendencies this time, but because I needed this day to be about George, not about the family drama that had preceded it. The guest list included our neighbors, my college friends, Jared's co-workers, and extended family members who hadn't been present for that infamous dinner. But they all knew. Word travels fast in families, especially when it involves DNA tests and public humiliation. Patricia arrived early, carrying an enormous wrapped present and wearing the kind of determined smile that suggested she'd practiced it in the mirror. "Olivia, darling, the decorations look wonderful," she said, kissing my cheek with theatrical warmth. Robert followed behind her, shaking Jared's hand with the careful formality of men trying to pretend nothing had changed between them. But I caught the way his eyes lingered on George, as if he was seeing his grandson clearly for the first time. My sister Jenny helped me arrange the food table, whispering updates about who had arrived and who was still expected. "Is she coming?" she asked, not needing to specify who she meant. I shook my head. Daisy sent her regret. That was putting it diplomatically. What Daisy had actually sent was a brief text 3 days earlier. "Won't be able to make George's party. Hope he has a nice day." No explanation, no attempt at reconciliation, just cold dismissal wrapped in polite language. Honestly, her absence was a relief. The party was complicated enough without having to navigate around the woman who'd started this entire mess. As guests filtered into our backyard, I watched Jared work the crowd with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been building up to something all day. He kept glancing at me, then at his watch, then back at me like he was waiting for some predetermined signal. The moment came after we'd sung, "Happy Birthday," and George had gleefully destroyed his smash cake, getting more frosting on his face than in his mouth. The crowd was laughing and taking pictures when Jared suddenly stood up, clearing his throat with the kind of theatrical gesture that demanded attention. "I'd like to say something," he announced, and conversations gradually died away until all eyes were focused on him. My stomach clenched. We'd discussed this moment during one of our counseling sessions, but experiencing it in real time felt surreal and deeply uncomfortable. "First, thank you all for being here to celebrate our son's first birthday," Jared began, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising steadiness. "George is obviously the star of today's show, and seeing him surrounded by so much love means everything to us." He paused, and I could see his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. This was the moment we'd been building toward. The public accountability I demanded as part of our marriage's reconstruction. "But I also need to address something that some of you may have heard about," he continued, and I felt the entire party's energy shift. People stopped chewing, stopped sipping their drinks, stopped pretending they weren't hanging on every word. "A few months ago, I made some comments and had some doubts about George's parentage that were completely unfounded and incredibly hurtful to my wife." His voice cracked slightly on the word unfounded, but he pushed through. "I questioned something that should never have been questioned, and I did it in a way that was disrespectful and cruel." I could see faces in the crowd processing this information, some with shock, others with the kind of knowing expressions that suggested the gossip mill had already reached them. "Olivia had a paternity test done to prove what she should never have had to prove, that George is my son, 99.99% certain, beyond any shadow of doubt." He looked directly at me then, and I saw genuine remorse in his eyes, not just performance anxiety. "I'm sorry, Olivia. I'm sorry for doubting you, for hurting you, and for making you feel like you had to defend yourself against accusations that should never have been made." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Our neighbor Mrs. Chin looked genuinely shocked. My friend Sarah was staring at Jared like he'd grown a second head. Even George seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, sitting quietly in his high chair with frosting-covered fingers. It should have felt like vindication, like justice, like the victory I'd been unconsciously seeking since that horrible dinner 2 months ago. Instead, it felt profoundly sad. Sad that we'd reached this point. Sad that my son's first birthday party had become the venue for his father's public penance. Sad that proof of love now required laboratory documentation and formal apologies delivered to audiences of neighbors and relatives. The applause that followed Jared's speech was polite but subdued. The kind of acknowledgement you give someone who's confessed to something embarrassing rather than someone who's done something admirable. As conversations gradually resumed and the party returned to something resembling normalcy, I found myself standing alone by the dessert table, watching George laugh as my father helped him chase soap bubbles across the grass. "That must have been difficult for you both," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Dr. Martinez, our marriage counselor, whom I'd impulsively invited the week before. "More difficult than I expected," I admitted. "I thought it would feel like closure, but mostly it just feels necessary but insufficient," she suggested gently. That was exactly right. The apology was something that needed to happen, but it couldn't undo months of damage or restore trust that had been systematically eroded. It was a first step, not a final solution. Over the following weeks, the absence of Daisy from our family gatherings became increasingly noticeable and increasingly welcome. Without her particular brand of toxic commentary, dinners at Robert and Patricia's house were actually pleasant. Conversations focused on normal family topics instead of thinly veiled criticisms and competitive jibes. I'd received one text from her about a month after the party, during what would have been our regular family Sunday dinner. "Hope everyone's doing well. Miss seeing George grow up." I'd stared at that message for a long time, thumb hovering over the reply button, considering various responses ranging from diplomatic to devastating. In the end, I'd simply deleted it without responding. Some bridges once burned should be allowed to turn to ash. The truth was, her absence had revealed how much of my family's stress had been centered around managing her jealousy and cruelty. Without that constant undercurrent of competition and criticism, I could actually enjoy spending time with Jared's parents, who turned out to be decent people when they weren't being influenced by their daughter's poison. But the most significant change wasn't in our family dynamics. It was in me. I'd stopped waiting for validation that might never come, stopped shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate my full presence, stopped seeking approval from people whose opinions had proven to be both unreliable and ultimately irrelevant to my happiness. The woman who had desperately wanted Patricia to call her daughter with genuine warmth was gone, replaced by someone who knew that respect mattered more than affection, and that boundaries were more valuable than belonging. George would grow up seeing his mother as someone who fought for herself and for him when it mattered most. He would learn that love without respect was incomplete, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. That envelope hadn't just contained DNA results. It had contained my transformation from a woman who begged for acceptance to one who demanded it be earned. This story of ultimate vindication had you absolutely hooked. Hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Olivia calmly handed Jared that envelope at the dinner table, knowing it would destroy his entire world. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more jaw-dropping stories of women who refuse to back down. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.